Please help me welcome Regent Norm Augustine.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, my friend. Hey, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I must say I'm shocked that you're leaving my talk to be with 6 members of Congress and the Senate that arrange your budget. Shows good judgment anyway. Also, it was a very generous introduction. For a moment there, I wasn't sure you were still talking about me, but you remind me a little bit of my first day on the faculty at Princeton when up until that time I'd spent my entire career either in government or in industry. And I was asked to give the welcoming lecture to the incoming freshman engineers. I had was at the day of the lecture. It was the first day, and the dean was making his opening remarks, and I wasn't paying much attention. I was flipping through my lecture notes, and all of a sudden I heard the dean say, "And now we will hear from Professor Augustine." This is absolutely true. For just an instant, the thought went through my mind, geez, what a coincidence. They've got some guy here by the same name as me. I really did. But it gets even worse when I got an honorary degree from my alma mater. Obviously, I was very proud. And the New York Times even carried an article about the thing. The headline read, Muhammad Ali and 3 others received Princeton degrees. So you can't win. I'm so pleased to have been asked to be a part of this series. What a wonderful series. And I'm just so impressed with the idea of doing something like this. And to be able to talk on the subject of leadership is something that I've had an interest in. I make no personal claims in terms of leadership. I've never studied it. I have no certificates or degrees or courses or anything. But I've worked for a lot of great leaders. I've been around a lot of great leaders, and I've studied them. And so I'm going to draw on that in my remarks today. You know, when you get into leadership and kind of curious about it, the first thing I did was go to the dictionary and look up the word leader. And the first description that caught my eye, it said, a short piece of catgut. Turns out that's a different kind of leader. So those of you who thought we were going to talk about fishing today, I'm sorry to disappoint you. There are so many definitions of leadership. General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, had one that I always thought was very provocative and good. He said that leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something that you want done because they want to do it. Pretty good definition. But it raises a lot of interesting questions to me. One, certainly leadership does require that people do things voluntarily, not through intimidation. But can leaders lead people voluntarily to do bad things? Are they really leaders? Was Hitler a leader? There were, for a time, people who followed him voluntarily. My belief is you cannot be a leader if you're leading people to do bad things. But that's one I leave for the philosophers among us, but it's always been a bit of an enigma to me. Leadership is different. Leadership, as I say, depends on voluntary following. Leadership is different from management. This is my definition of management in just 14 words. If you learn that, you don't have to go to business school. I should have said that here. But management has really been said to be the art of making things happen right. Leadership is the art of making the right things happen right. The best definition I've ever seen of leadership, though, I ran across, of all places, in the British Officers' Cemetery on the cliffs above the Normandy beaches. And it said leadership is wisdom and courage and carelessness of self. There was just one word I would add to that, which is character. That would, I think, have made it better. But this is a definition, if you want a short definition, that's the best I have ever been able to see. Since we're in an academic environment, I thought I'd start with a quiz, a two-question quiz. The first question is, would you invest your money in these people? And the second one, who is their leader? And the answer is that I hope you would invest in these people, because that was the originators of the Microsoft Corporation. And their leader is that little fellow down at the bottom left there, which makes an important point that you can't recognize leaders by the way they look. You can't even recognize them by their personality or way of acting. Leaders come wrapped in a lot of different wrappings, but as I'm going to try to explain, down inside those wrappings, there are a lot of common ingredients. One thing that's certain about leadership is that one person can make a huge difference. Let me just use one example here. This is A.G. Lafley. A.G. ran and again runs today Procter & Gamble. It's a company with 130,000 employees. And is that screen too bright, or could you see it all right? You okay in the back? Can you see it? Yes? Okay. Let's see, I don't seem to have a pointer, but if you look at the curve there, you can see Procter & Gamble's stock was going up. This is clipped out of the newspaper. Their stock was going up, and at the very peak there, the board, and I was a member at the time, AG was going to retire, and we had to pick a new, excuse me, I got it backwards. The person before AG was going to retire, and we had to pick a new CEO. And AG was one of two candidates, and we did not select him at that time. And the person we did select at the very top there, we were worried about, but he had great experience, had worked his way through the ranks, and so we thought he would be a great leader, even though we had some trepidation. Well, as you can see, within a matter of months, the company was in shambles. This is a company with 130,000 employees. At the bottom of that drop, we made one change in the whole company. We put AG in as CEO. And the stock, as you can see, began to go right up. Today, it would be up there on the ceiling or the next floor in terms of extending that plot. And as I said, we'd made only one change. Now, AG would be the first person to tell you that he didn't do this. What he did was make it possible for everybody else to operate at their maximum potential. He created an environment where everybody else could excel, whereas the first person before him did quite the opposite. So here's an example of one person in a 130,000 person organization almost overnight turning it over. And I might mention AG is one of the, if he were in this room, nobody would notice him. He's very quiet, very dignified person, not at all outgoing or charismatic, just a great leader, has the ingredients. Unfortunately, as we've seen, and as there are other examples, leaders can have the opposite impact in very large organizations. This was from Fortune magazine in 2011, and it was the most admired companies in their field. And as you can see, there was a company called Enron at the very top, and by a very large margin. 10 months later, this was the cover of that same magazine, Fortune, pointing out lies, arrogance, betrayal, and the disaster that occurred to that company because of a failure of leadership. Most of these folks, like as in this case, were not fundamentally bad people who came to work and said, let's see what bad things I could do today and get away with. Most of them, I've known 7 people, I'm sorry to say, who went to prison. 5 of them were friends. They were decent people. They worked in the White House, they were CEOs, they were presidential appointees. They made one huge slip in life and destroyed their life and the lives of people around them. They, in most cases, didn't do it for personal gain, which is even more puzzling. But it's an example of how things can go wrong when leaders slip up. Another thing is that leadership, how's that? Oh yeah, that makes a big difference. Another thing, that reminds me one time that happened before, and I asked, can anyone hear me? And a fellow in the back row said no, and the fellow in the front row jumped up and said, I can, I'll trade you seats. That's a bad joke. That wasn't in the script, we didn't plan that. Importantly, leadership is not a popularity contest. No better example than Churchill, who sort of saved the West in World War II, and not long after that, his own people threw him out of office. Another thing about leadership, there's a Swedish proverb that says, every ship has a great captain in calm seas. The real test of leadership is when the storm is raging, when the waters are surging. That's when one finds out who are the leaders. Probably the greatest leadership challenge in my own career occurred when the Berlin Wall fell rather suddenly. At that time, the world's aerospace industries also collapsed. It was a great time for the world, obviously, the end of the Cold War. For the aerospace industry around the world, it was a very difficult time. And in fact, within 5 years, the US aerospace industry lost 40% of its employees. That was 640,000 people. We lost 3/4 of the companies. And when we first started out on that, the initial goal was, how do we survive? When I used to meet with my colleagues at Martin Marietta at the time, I would always like to begin with a quote from Woody Allen that struck me as so appropriate when the seas are rough. He said, more than any other time in history, we face a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly. That indeed was the way we felt when we began our strategic planning meetings of what do we do right after the Cold War ended. We had a simple strategy that we adopted, which was that we would combine our company with other companies that also had half-full factories and bloated overheads, and we would then shrink the companies so that whatever was left would be operating at full efficiency. And assuming that our others wouldn't do it as quickly as we did, that we would then be able to gain market share. And so our goal was to gain market share, not to make a profit for a period of time, although we did. But the assumption was that when the market came back, which we were confident it would, unfortunately for the world standpoint, we would be in a strong position. So during that same 5 years when the marketplace was collapsing, we combined all or parts of 17 different fairly well-known companies to create Lockheed Martin. We grew from $4 billion per year revenues to $44 billion revenues during those same 5 years. That was the toughest experience probably in terms of leadership in my career, as I said. Let me talk a little bit about the essentials of leadership, at least as I've learned them. I'll offer a baker's dozen here. And one of the things I did, and if you're interested in leadership, I would encourage you to do, it was kind of fun. I made a list of all the leaders, people I considered to be leaders whom I've known. And once I made, there were 30 people, I cut it off at that. 30 people, and once I did that, I wrote beside each of their names, why did I put them on my list? And it forces you to kind of think through, in very tangible terms, what makes a great leader. After I did that, I went through and I looked for patterns, and I found that there were 13 major characteristics that caused these people to be, in my opinion, great leaders. And some of them were famous people that I had the good fortune to work with. Some you would know. Others were people you've never heard of, but in my view were great leaders. My list among the former included General Omar Bradley and General Jimmy Doolittle, and Admiral Arleigh Burke, Sandra O'Connor, Coach K, Elizabeth Dole, Jack Welch, Bill Marriott, Dave Packard, Chuck Vest, Warren Buffett, Neil Armstrong, and many others. We have leaders around us. We happen to have, in my opinion, a great leader of your organization who's here today and introduced me. But as I said, many of the leaders on my list are folks that I just happen to run across who you would not have known. And of these 13 items that appeared as a pattern, it became apparent that, as I said, the wrapping of the people was very different. You compare Coach K with Woody Hayes or something like that, or Vince Lombardi. Totally different, or Bill Marriott with Jack Welch. But the underlying qualities are there, and those are what I would like to talk about. And so I'm going to go through those in the remainder of my time. And I'm going to start out, as you might have suspected, with character. And the question here is, what do you do when you come to the fork in the road? And when I speak in business schools, I always like to open my discussion of character, or of ethics in particular, with a little quiz. And the quiz goes as follows. I'd like to share with you some numbers and see if you can recognize what those numbers are. They're as follows. Swiss First Boston, 1.5. Imclone, 7. Rite Aid, 8. Westar, 18. Adelphia, 15. Dynergy, 24. Tyco, 25. WorldCom, 25. Enron, 165. And then I asked the students at the business schools, what are those numbers? And somebody will say, well, are they their stock price? And no, that's not what they are. Somebody else will say, well, maybe the return on investment? And I say, no, that's not what it is. Everybody finally gives up, and I say, those are the number of years their executives were sentenced to prison. It tends to cause the students to pay more attention to what I have to say after that. On the other hand, there are happy stories. There's a story not widely known, pertains to Inland Containers, a huge container corporation. There was a young man there, middle career person. His name was Herb Krannert. And he was making significant contributions. One day the CEO came to him and said, I'm very impressed with what you're doing. And we want to get some younger people on the board, and so I'm going to propose to the board that you become a member of the board of Inland Container. Well, he was obviously thrilled. He was very young for this, and but then the CEO went on. He said there will be only one condition, that is that you will always vote exactly the way I tell you. Krannert thought for a minute, and he said, I quit. And he did. He resigned. He left. 2 days later, his doorbell rings, and he's sitting at home, and 6 of his friends that he worked with came. One said, could we come in and visit? We heard what happened, and we decided we don't want to work for a company like that either, and so we all resigned. And what we thought is that maybe we could sit down together and you could help us figure out, you could tell us how we could form a company maybe, and we could all have great jobs. And Krannert says, well, you know, I've got a problem. I don't even have a job myself at this point in time. And they said, well, let's talk. Well, they did, and I got this wrong. I misspoke. It was another container company that offered him the job that he resigned from. And in their living room that day, they formed Inland Container Corporation, which grew and grew to be a very successful firm, heavily based on character of leadership. Another example I always like is the story of Jim Burke, who was a friend of mine. Jim ran Johnson & Johnson back in the day. And you may recall the Tylenol murders where there were, I think it was 7 people died from tampering with Tylenol products, with Tylenol, and that was sold in stores. And the question was to Jim, do we recall all the Tylenol that's out on the market or not? There were those who said if you do that, it'll imply some admission or evidence of guilt on our part. We made perfectly good Tylenol. We can't control what people do with it after it goes out. Some other people said to him, it'll cost us a couple $100 million to bring all this back, and the impact it's going to have on our stock price. It's our best product. It'll be disastrous. Jim said he really had no choice. He had to look out for their customers. And as you may recall, they recalled 125,000 bottles of Tylenol. And since that time, for many years, when people talked about companies that were ethical companies, Johnson & Johnson was the first name that always came up. I always liked the Omar Khayyam statement, the moving finger writes and having writ moves on. Not all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel a half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it. Well said. Let me talk about the second ingredient, which is vision. Some people have good vision, some people don't. Here's an example of bad vision. On the other hand, another example of bad vision. Western Union was one of the largest, most powerful companies in its day. Alexander Graham Bell offered them the patent rights on something called the telephone for $100,000. He was turned down. And if you dig back in the files of Western Union, there's a memo that asks the question, what could you say with a telephone that you can't say with Morse code? An example of not thinking strategically. I lived through an example of this myself, if you'll permit a personal example. Down there at the very bottom left corner on my chart, I had just left the government and was trying to decide where to go back in industry, and there were two companies that I was considering seriously going with. One was Martin Aerospace and the other was Fairchild. Both in the aerospace business, both almost identical sales at the time, both headquartered about 3 miles apart up here on what's now I-270. And so the question is, which one do you join? And this was at a time when the missiles and space business, particularly the space business, was just beginning to emerge. Fairchild's leadership said, we build airplanes. We don't do electronics and missiles and space. We do airplanes. The Martin Marietta leadership said, we probably better learn to do missiles and space and electronics. And so they took two very divergent paths, and you can see what the result was in terms of their annual revenues versus time. There were other things, obviously, that took place, but it was that fundamental decision that cast them on these two totally different curves. And the last time Fairchild was heard from, at least that I heard from, and they were sold to a French firm for $68 million after a year's loss of $20 million. So it does make a difference, having the ability to, as Jack Welch says, to see around corners. Hope is not a strategy, though. An important part of vision is having a strategy. Here's a fellow with a lot of hope, but you notice the name is not Starbucks on the building either. And similarly, in the other worlds, hope is not a strategy. Here's when GM Loss shows plan is working. Turnaround on car maker loses $115 million. That doesn't sound like it's working very well. Neither is self-delusion. Earnings season not as awful as some feared. Omit the poor financials and the first quarter is up. My board would never have bought that. But a strategy needs to be simple. I described our strategy. It just had 4 steps, very simple. The simplest strategy I ever heard was Ronald Reagan when he was asked what his strategy was for the Cold War. That was it. That brings me to the next topic, which is competence. It is important to know something about what you're doing, even to get the details right here. And in my own field, Jay said I'm an engineer, aerospace engineer, incidentally, which means you should pay attention because I really am a rocket scientist. So, this is a trainable antenna that some engineers designed and had built. It's the size of a football field, and it could be pointed in different directions. It has thousands of little attachments in it to make it up. And unfortunately, within it, there was something called a single point failure mode that the engineers didn't recognize. Single point failure modes are very bad things to design into products. That's what happened when there was one failure of an item within the antenna. It propagated. The question about the topic of competence. I think of Michael Jordan. I love sports, so forgive if I use some analogies here. Michael Jordan, you may remember, played professional baseball a few years, but he was never known as a leader of his team. He was in the minor leagues. On the other hand, in basketball, he was really known as a leader. And so it's a good thing to be pretty competent in what you're doing if you want to be recognized as a leader. Then there's the all-critical issue of judgment. Another example from the engineering world, the designers of the Titanic Interesting, the Titanic was designed to carry 2,224 passengers. The designers considered their ship to be absolutely unsinkable. So they included only 1,178 lifeboat positions for the 2,224 passengers, about one for every two people. Now, the judgment here seems to be a bit flawed. If the ship was really unsinkable, you don't need any lifeboat positions. If the ship is sinkable, you need at least enough lifeboat positions for every passenger and crew member. Under no circumstance can you justify having half as many lifeboat positions as there are people aboard the ship, unless you think the ship's going to half sink or something like that. Unfortunately, we all know the outcome, that about half the passengers on board lost their lives. Let me turn to an example that I was hoping Jay would still be here for this one because it fits his dilemma of the last hour as to where to go. You may recall a few years ago when Ford was having problems with its Explorer rolling over and caused some problems between Ford and Firestone tires and so on. And the Congress asked the president of Ford to appear before a committee of the House and the Senate the following day for a hearing on what was going on, why they hadn't reported this problem earlier. A number of people were killed. The head of Ford put out a press release that went as follows. Ford said yesterday that President Jacques Nasser is too busy with the recall to testify to the House or Senate tomorrow. Now, this is an example of very bad judgment because it turns out that the members of the House and the Senate have another way of getting you there, and that's called a subpoena. The following day, under a subpoena, they appeared, and here they are now being sworn in before an extremely hostile group of members of Congress. And before long, Florida also summoned them, as do many other states. Example of doing things so poorly in terms of judgment. Warren Buffett gives some great advice on this topic. Warren says, tell the truth and tell it fast, which in most crises is awfully good advice. Then there's the matter of just candor as part of judgment and part of Warren Buffett's advice. If President Nixon and President Clinton, I think, had just been candid with the American public, the outcome, I think, would have been very different. I had an experience in that regard in my own that I'll share briefly. A member of our company had done, a very senior member, had done something very wrong. Fortunately not illegal, but nobody would think it was right. And the Washington Post found out about it before I did, which I didn't appreciate, but told a story about it. So I got an outside law firm because I wanted to do an independent investigation and asked them to look into it. And they came back and said, things are actually worse than you know. There's another half of the story that's even worse. Fortunately, still not illegal, but worse. And as luck would have it, Congressman Dingell, who many people would have described him somewhat admiringly as a junkyard dog when it comes to holding hearings. He decided to hold a hearing on this, and guess who was going to get to be the witness? I was the CEO, so I was going to get to be the witness. So I went to see him about a week before the hearing took place, and I said, Mr. Chairman, what you read in the papers, unfortunately, is true. And I said, there's another half to the story that you don't know that I will share with you. And I told him the other half to the story. And I closed by saying, this is not the way our company normally operates. This is what we've done about it. We're terribly embarrassed. We apologize, and I don't think it'll happen again. And it was funny. I could see as I was ending my conversation, he was smiling. And when I quit talking, he said, this is no fun. That's exactly what he said. This is no fun. And he said, how am I going to have a hearing if you're going to do that? I've got to have all morning to drag this out of you on TV. And he canceled the hearing. And John and I since have become very good friends to this day, a man I admire a great deal. And the only thing we did in terms of judgment was pretty simple. It also pertains to ethics. We told the truth. There are a lot of examples of bad judgment. I always love this one, being as an academic environment. Here's a student who didn't exercise very good judgment, I thought. And that brings us to the next topic, which is courage. One of my most admired examples of courage and of candor is this newspaper ad from about 1900 that Ernst Shackleton put in the London papers regarding his expedition to Antarctica. Ben wanted, pardon the sexist attitude, but this was 1900, whatever that proves, for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Over 5,000 people signed up to say they wanted to go on the voyage with him. And it teaches another important message, that is that great leaders do challenging things. Great leaders don't just do little things. You'll never be known as a great leader for just keeping the trains on time. Newt Gingrich once asked me if I knew why lions don't hunt chipmunks. And I said, no, I don't know why. I was doing something that apparently he didn't think was very major. And I said, I don't know why. Why do lions not hunt chipmunks? And he said, because if they catch them, they starve to death. Very good point. Then also there's the occasion I was on Capitol Hill. This was several years ago with Buzz Aldrin, and we were trying to get some money to promote the space program. And Buzz started campaigning for a mission to Mars that would be a one-way mission. The people would just stay on Mars and live there. There would be no plan to bring them back. And I was so stunned, I said, Buzz, who would ever agree to do a thing like that? And he looked at me and he said, did you ever hear of the Pilgrims? Interesting point. There are people who will take on great challenges. And I found that people can stand, they can stand great challenges. They can stand bad news. The one thing people can't stand is uncertainty. So you all know the story of Ernest Shackleton. His ship was crushed in the ice down on the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica. It took 2.5 years for him to get his people all back. He got all 28 people back with only one minor injury in the crew. Which brings us to the subject of risk-taking, which is another ingredient. Sometimes risks have to be taken. If you're going to run a lighthouse and keep the light bulbs on, you may have to take risks, like the fellow standing in the doorway there. On the other hand, there's such a thing as taking irrational risks, which to me, this famous picture, I always considered to be not a wise risk. I'll share with you a story. I was taking a little course, you might call it. It was a weekend thing with the leadership of the Army when I was there. And the speaker was talking about taking risks and making the point about being some risks worth taking and others not worth taking. He posited that there was an I-beam laying on the floor in front of where he was speaking, and he got a volunteer from the audience, not a volunteer, he called on somebody, and this is a true story. The fellow from the audience stands up and he said, now, if you will walk across that I-beam on the floor, that imaginary I-beam, I would give you $20. Would you agree to do that? And the guy in the audience said, sure. And he said, okay, change it just a little teeny bit. He said, I'm going to take that identical I-beam and suspend it between two 40-story buildings out over a highway. And I'll still give you the same $20 to walk across the same I-beam. Would you do it? And the guy in the audience said, no, I wouldn't. And the speaker should have quit because he'd made his point, but he kept going. And he said, okay, supposing that that same I-beam was between the two buildings, and you're on that building over there, and I'm on this building at the top over here, and I'm holding one of your kids out over the edge. And I say to you, if you don't walk across that I-beam and get your kid, I'm going to drop him. He said, now would you walk across the I-beam? And the guy, without hesitation, says, which kid do you have? One day, some years ago when I was working at Martin Marietta, across the ticker came this shows how long ago it was. Across the ticker came this statement that the Bendix Corporation, which was a large corporation at the time, was going to do a hostile takeover of our company, which means they were going to buy our company and throw out the management and take it over. And they offered a substantial sum of money to do this, and they did it so quickly that they owned 72% of our stock before we could do anything at all. We had shark watches and so on, but they didn't work, as it turned out. And the question was, what do we do? They own 72% of our stock. Well, my predecessor as CEO was Tom Panal, a graduate of the Naval Academy, who was kind of a don't give up the ship guy. And Tom and our advisors on Wall Street said, there's one thing that might save you, but it's high risk. And the reason we were trying to save the company was that Bendix made components, whereas we made major systems, and we thought that Bendix probably would destroy the company. And so the question, we wanted to try to convince the shareholders of this, but we needed an opportunity to do that so the shareholders could vote of both companies. Well, the strategy that Tom and the others came up with was that if Bendix was going to own us, we would own them. So we announced we're going to buy Bendix. And we did. We bought a majority of their shares. So it's the first time this has ever happened in history. Two huge companies own each other. They wanted to meet in our board meeting, we wanted to meet in their boardroom. We were competing with each other for business, but we wanted to lose, because if we lose, they win, and we get the money if they win. But they wanted to lose because the opposite was true. It's all very clear. It was really quite a horrible experience. And anyway, we had announced we're going to buy Bendix's shares. And as I say, we did eventually. As an aside, there was one glitch in our strategy when we announced it, and that was that after we announced it, somebody pointed out that there are two regulations on the books. One regulation says that if another company owns a majority of your shares, you can't buy any of their shares for 21 days after they took down a majority of your shares. The other regulation said that under those same circumstances, you couldn't buy the other company's shares on the 21st day or thereafter, or after the 21st day, I guess it was. And so it looked like our strategy had been blown out of the tub. Well, late one Saturday night, one of our attorneys was in our headquarters law library down the road here. And she noticed in the appendix to these regulations that one regulation, the day ended at midnight. The other one, it began at 12:01 a.m. on the 21st day. So we have 1 minute to buy the other company, which is what we did. And I've always described that Tom Panal's leadership as not being just courageous, it was audacity. One of the good things, though, when you do take risks is you can take steps to minimize those risks. And as an aeronautical engineer, I always loved this one. They obviously had a problem with roll stability on this airplane. And so they were hedging the bet on when they landed, how it might work out. Risk-taking, I've found that really 5 lessons. Be sure you know what you're trying to accomplish. Be sure you understand the risks. Most people don't. Be sure the benefits are worth the downside. Have a plan to ameliorate the risks, and be certain the worst case is survivable, which can't always be the case, but often is. Listening, another example, if you'll forgive me from my field, because that's what I'm most familiar with. Just prior to the launch of the Challenger space shuttle, the engineers were sending out memos like this one. One of them began with the word help in capital letters, not the kind of emails engineers normally write. Another one said that it is my honest and real fear that if we do not take immediate action, we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all the launch pad facilities and so on. Nobody listened to them. And in fact, the meeting the night before the launch of the Challenger had, I think anybody in this room been there and been presented all the data that was available, which was not presented. I don't think there'd be a soul here that would have launched the Challenger that night. Unfortunately, they did not get all the data. And we all know the very sad outcome. That brings me to the subject of decisiveness. When one is a leader, one often has to make decisions in a timely fashion. Things happen quickly. And one of my favorite examples of being really decisive in the corporate world was taken from the CEO of the Northrop Corporation, Kent Kressa, who was a good friend and competitor. And I happened to run across the article about him in USA Today when by chance we were sitting next to each other in an auditorium waiting for a meeting to start. And I ran across this statement here. It said, CEO Kent Kressa also said Northrop will continue to sell non-productive assets. Last year it sold its headquarters in Los Angeles. I thought that was very decisive. Brings me to motivation and the ability to motivate people around you. I have this book of laws that I wrote. One of my laws, probably one of the ones most quoted, was it says that motivation will almost always beat mere talent. And I've certainly seen that to be true. I'll give you an example. This is a nuclear submarine. The Navy's nuclear submarine fleet at the time was overseen by Admiral Bruce DeMars. And one of the things that Bruce always did, the first dive, when they go down slowly for 4 days, slowly testing the hull to see if it'll crush. The engineers run around with flashlights and strain gauges on the hull and all. It's pretty exciting, I guess. And anyway, he always went on the first dive of every new submarine. And I complimented him. I said, I really admire you for doing that. And he said, yeah. And he said, you know, I've been thinking about that. Your company builds so much stuff on these submarines, it would be awfully nice if you went with me. This is what's known as an invitation you cannot refuse. Actually, I was thrilled about it, excited, and spent some time these test dives. But it was an example of motivation because I'll tell you, I paid a lot of attention to not only submarines, but spacecraft and so on. The motivation he gave me, I already was motivated, but that extra bit, I became very intolerant of anything that looked like it was slightly askance. It could make an enormous difference. Communication obviously comes up. If you want to motivate people, if you want to be a leader, you've got to be a communicator. Certainly, though, one of the things that one has to do is be able to listen as well as to talk. Some leaders fail at that, and I think of the story of the basketball coach who, for Boston, who had played for Boston. He was now a rookie coach, had been a great player. And unfortunately, I can't pull his name up, but there was about 5 seconds left in the game. They were behind by 1 point, and he calls. He was coaching the Bulls, and Michael Jordan, of course, was on the Bulls at the time. And he calls his team together and said, "We've got 5 seconds." And Michael Jordan interrupts and says, "Get the ball to me, and let's win this, and get the hell out of here." And he looks at Michael Jordan and he realizes his future's kind of on the line here. I mean, he's supposed to be the coach of this team. And he said, first of all, he interrupted, he said, "Let me make very clear that I am the coach of this team. And I will decide what we do. And I will listen to others, but nobody else will tell me what we're going to do." And with that, he said, "Okay, now here's what we're going to do. We're going to get the ball to Michael and sink that ball and get the hell out of here." It's a good example of listening. And when I went off to teach after, as I said, my time in industry and government, I happened by just coincidence to have breakfast with Warren Buffett the day of my first class. And I said, "What's the most important thing that you've learned that I could teach my students?" And his answer was to teach them to always have someone around who can tell the emperor he has no clothes. Awfully good advice. And I've seen so many cases where whole organizations walk off the cliff because nobody has the courage to stand up and say, "This isn't right." Think back to the Watergate, or think of Enron. It takes time to communicate. Every time we put companies together, the leader of the company we had bought, if they would, and myself, would go out and talk to groups of employees. Sometimes, like this group here, 5,000 employees, and this is the hangar that we build airplanes in Fort Worth. It's a high bay hangar. It's a mile long, and we'd pass out cards, and people would anonymously write questions on the cards. I'd try to go through one after the other and answer them. It took an awful lot of time, but it paid great dividends because it gave me a chance to find out what was bothering people, and on the other hand, for them to hear what I hoped we could accomplish with the new company we were forming. And it's not enough, though, just to talk to people, to be decisive. You've also got to get it right. You can't send conflicting signals, and that just adds to problems. And I had the misfortune in my career of having to tell 2 Fortune 100 CEOs that their services were no longer needed by their firms. And the two people, this all occurred within about 3 months of each other. And the two leaders were both fine people, decent people, who'd worked their way up from the bottom and been promoted many times. But when they became CEO, two conflicting, just the opposite qualities or lack of qualities appeared. One of them became a ready, fire, aim leader. The other one became a ready, aim leader. And both of them lost their jobs because the one fired without thinking and the other one couldn't make a decision, couldn't pull the trigger. And of course, my favorite example of communication is the Henry V at Agincourt in his St. Crispin's Day speech that changed the course of history. And if you haven't seen the movie of that, you've got to do it. I want to talk a little bit about perseverance. And this has to do with overcoming adversity. And let me show you an ad United Technologies ran in the newspapers. It dropped out of grade school, ran a country store, went broke, took 15 years to pay off his bills, took a wife, unhappy marriage, ran for House, lost twice, ran for Senate, lost twice, delivered a speech that became a classic. The audience did different. Attacked daily by the press and despised by half the country. And he signed his name A. Lincoln. Once again, it's not a popularity contest, but you've got to be able to persevere. How does a person deal with adversity? This fellow's got some adversity going here. And in Jack Welch's words, does he get back on his horse? You expect leaders are going to come off their horse occasionally, but do they get back on it? Harold Shapiro said, "I don't recommend failure, nor am I attracted to the idea of failure builds character, but the willingness to accept the risks of failure is one of the costs of leadership, and therefore the price of all success." And that brings me to selflessness. It's so very, very important. Good leaders never think of themselves. They never take self-interest into mind. They're always thinking of their troops. Here's a leader and her troops, but she's not thinking of her troops. She's just thinking about herself, and the outcome is not good. And that reminds me of in the British Army, as in our Army, every officer is given a formal rating, written rating every year, in which their superior officer writes about them. And the one that has always stuck in my mind for the British Army was where the superior officer had written about the person he was rating. He wrote, this officer's troops would follow him anywhere, mostly out of curiosity. That's not leadership. On the other hand, this is leadership. The story is told 2,300 years ago of Alexander the Great, who was leading his army across a scorching desert for 11 days, had run out of water, sent foragers out to gather water. They came back with one canteen full of water, and as the story is told, in front of his army, Alexander the Great took the canteen and dumped it upside down and said there's no purpose in one person drinking when others cannot. That's leadership. And one thing that too many leaders forget today, particularly in the business world, is that the reward of command is the opportunity to lead, not to have a bigger tent. And of all people, General George Custer said that. And I've also learned that leadership, this is from my book of laws, that's a plug for my book of laws. If any of you happen to have a copy, let me congratulate you on being a member of a very select small group. But if you combine greed with hubris and add financial leverage, it can be assured the disaster is not left to chance, and indeed that's been the case. Then there's the matter of passion, which counts so much. One of the fellows I used to work with was quite a baseball fan, and he always said, you've got to be willing to slide head first. You can tell the baseball players who really have passion when they're willing to go in head first when they need to, as is this fellow here. There are so many examples of cases where little teeny differences in sports. One thing about sports is you can measure the outcome. It's very measurable, very real. In sports, a tiny difference is the difference between first place and being forgotten. The first person to run the 4-minute mile, or you go through all the examples where just a fraction of a second will make a huge difference in a major event. And it's often the passion, the commitment that makes that tiny difference. Stated otherwise, in the words of Vince Lombardi, who had a way with words, he used to gather his team on the first day of every season and tell them that if you are not fired with enthusiasm, you will be fired with enthusiasm. That then completes my baker's dozen list of 13 qualities that those 30 people that I looked at evidenced. But then there's a question of, I've talked about leadership and things going along. What do you do if you're a leader and things go wrong? And I just want to say a few words about that. Yeah. So how's your day going? Clearly, leadership in a crisis is critical. And one of the things that I've noticed in watching leaders during crises, and boy, there are a lot of them, is that they often manage to make things worse. I think of, here's some crises in recent years that, in most cases actually, the person involved actually managed to make them worse. One not on there, but I think of, I grew up in Colorado, and we have a little house out in the mountains there. And a few years ago, some of the hills in Colorado had caught on fire, trees on the hills. And the governor of Colorado wanted to get money for the federal government to help fight the fires and so on, logically enough. He went on TV and he said, Colorado is burning. And the next day, he forgot that there was another audience that listened to him on TV, and virtually every tourist that was planning to come to the state canceled their reservations to come to the state. I've been involved in so many reviews since I retired. This is a partial list of crises that occurred in various areas. Some of them unbelievable, like the first one, the nuclear security incident. That was one of these unthinkable things. Just quickly to show you how things happen. 2 years ago, in the middle of the night, an 82-year-old nun cut through 4 security fences, went through 3 shoot-to-kill zones, and got to the building where some of our most dangerous, if you will, nuclear materials are stored. Heavily guarded, but she managed to do that in the middle of the night. She got to the building and the guards still didn't show up to do anything about it, so she takes a hammer out of her backpack and starts pounding on the walls. The guards say, oh, the carpenters are working tonight, and still didn't come out to see what happened. I and 2 others were asked to investigate how could this happen, but it's another example of a crisis that was not handled well. And you could go down the list. Those are the ones I happen to have had occasions to have some after-the-fact involvement. And don't expect kind of treatment when you get into a crisis like that from either the media or the government. and soon they will send the investigators out. Here come the investigators, and what they want to know, of course, is what went wrong, what did you know, and when did you know it? There are really three favorite flavors of crises, some that are just beyond your control. A meteorite lands in your building and knocks your building apart. Another is honest mistakes or incompetence. And then there are the third kind that you never recover from, which are ethical missteps. A simple example of how to turn a problem into a crisis comes from last November, when you may recall the DC government put out a voter's guide to advise the people living in DC how to go about voting. After they printed 30,000 copies and distributed them, an enterprising reporter noticed that the DC flag is upside down on the documents, and asked the DC spokesperson, and her comment was, and I quote, "It was a gimmick to engage voters after the low turnout in the primary elections. We meant to do it. People are responding, aren't they? It's working." As you can imagine, the next day she was back up there saying that actually that wasn't what happened. They made a mistake and didn't realize it. But by now they've converted what was just a matter of ineptitude, which most of us can relate to, they've converted it into a case of ineptitude and dishonesty. If you want to turn a crisis into a catastrophe, here's the way to do it. This is my list. If you can get any four of these, you probably can succeed in turning it into a catastrophe. So that brings me back to crisis management for leaders, which again I quote Warren Buffett, "Tell the truth and tell it fast, and one will have a much better day as a leader." Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. Thank you. Now, we have lost our leader, and so no, we haven't. Are you going to do this?
I am a cheap fill-in, yes.
Terrific.
So I think we have some time for a few questions for Mr. Augustine if there are any in the audience. And do we have microphones that we're getting around, folks? If not, we're going to speak loud. Any questions in the room, please? Yes, sir.
So when you come into a crisis, how many times in your experience can you actually turn the crisis into a positive event?
Yeah, the question was, could you hear me if I'm out here with this? I guess I better stay here. The question was, how many times can you turn a crisis into a positive event? And we've all heard Rahm Emanuel's statement that a crisis is something terrible to waste or something like that. And I think there's truth to that. You can do that on occasion. I think in most crises, at least my experience is, you're lucky to get out of them uninjured or not seriously injured. But there are ones. And one crisis, not of our causing, that I would have to think of right away was when the aerospace industry was collapsing. We built Lockheed Martin. And we would never have been able to build Lockheed Martin in normal times because we didn't do hostile takeovers as a matter of principle. We didn't get involved in auctions as a matter of principle. And so it was just a set of circumstances. It was a crisis for the industry, but it turned out to be a great opportunity for us. And so there are those occasions. I think Johnson & Johnson's case was one, but there are a lot fewer of those, frankly, than there are the ones where I think probably 70% of the time you make it worse in your management. 25% of the time you escape without too much damage, and 5% you might. That would be my guess.
Other questions, please. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm proud to say that my father worked for Lockheed Aircraft for 42 years, starting in 1939. And he always praised the company for being so kind and interactive with the rank and file. He was a flight test mechanic, for instance, and people like Kelly Johnson, the great designer would talk to the mechanics just the same way he was with engineers, et cetera. And it resonated with me when you were showing your hangar with 5,000 employees in there for an employee meeting. I think that's a real key to success, is having the leaders communicate directly to the rank and file.
You know, when I was gainfully employed, whenever I had the chance to talk to employees, I would talk about three things that I always try to emphasize to them. One, we will operate the company ethically. One, we will serve our customers well. And thirdly, we'll treat everyone with respect. And if you do, that used to bother the people on Wall Street. What about profit? But if you do those things, profit seemed to take care of itself. And Kelly Johnson, who ran our skunk works out in California, and amazing man, was a classic example of that. And Kelly, the person who hired him later in life, Kelly was Swedish. The fellow who hired him later in life said about Kelly, he said, "That damn Swede can see air." And he really could. He could look at an airplane and tell you what the air was doing. And a remarkable person. Your father in 1939, so he was there during World War II, which must have been a very exciting time. And of course, all the plants in the industry of those days had camouflage netting over them with artificial. Same true here in Baltimore at the Martin plant. Huge. You couldn't see that there was a huge plant there, and they would move the cars, the wooden cars and wooden building, not buildings, wooden cars and cows and things around so that you couldn't tell that it wasn't a real farm scene. But your point is certainly true. Face-to-face communication is so far more effective. We all learned that. You remember that video conferencing was going to replace sitting on airplanes. I wish it had, but it never even came close. And so face-to-face does matter.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
As you know, our city is going through a very challenging time. What words of wisdom would you give to the leadership of the city, state, and even the university who's helping?
Great question, which I frankly have not thought about from that perspective. Question was, what advice would I have the audacity to offer to the, you didn't say that, I said that, to offer to the leadership of the city under the circumstances that it finds itself in. And number one is be absolutely truthful, painfully truthful. Number two is don't overpromise. It is so easy when you're under the gun to make promises of things you're going to do. Number three is forget yourself. You're just a player on the stage. If you're a CEO, you're just a high-paid employee. You don't own the company. Other people do. If you're the mayor, or the attorney general, or whatever you may be, you're there just to help the people. And forget about yourself and your career, and make the most of the hand you've been dealt. And I think if those three things really stand out in my mind. And the other is don't jump to conclusions, and also set goals, major goals that are feasible, that you could reach. And listen to others, sit down with others, and try to get their views. It's been a terribly tough time for this city, obviously, and this could be one of those cases where something good comes out of it, actually, believe it or not.
Mr. Wood.
You have a wonderful story to tell about listening to workers, listening to people up and down the ladder, involving the weight problem on the space shuttle. Could you tell us that story?
Well, I'd be happy to do that. I've been asked to share a story about listening to people, and listening to people at all levels. It occurred at our plant in Michoud in New Orleans, where we built a large fuel tank, external fuel tank that carried the fuel, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, not real good things to mix around each other. It carried that, and it also was the structural backbone of the space shuttle stack. And I once calculated that fuel tank was so big that if you put it on its side, that the Wright brothers' famous flight could literally have taken place entirely inside of that fuel tank. So it's big. The circumstance that occurred right after the first few flights, NASA gave us a contract to take 8,000 pounds of weight out of the fuel tank. And so we got all the star engineers together and figured out how do you take weight out of that fuel tank. You may recall that the fuel tank, the first few flights was white and painted white. And anyway, the engineers got 7,200 pounds of weight out of that tank, which was a big deal. And they could not seem to get the last 800 pounds. And one day a group of engineers were standing around a table discussing what they could do. They were talking about using lightweight welds and lightweight rivets and saving an ounce here and an ounce there. And a fellow from the factory came by and happened to overhear, but he just stood there and was listening to them for quite a while. And finally, he asked the folks in the engineers there, he said, why don't you not paint the fuel tank white? Well, there was silence. And finally, one of the engineers said, space hardware is always painted white. And the guy didn't give up, fortunately. After a little more silence, he said, why don't you not paint this space hardware white? More silence. Finally, one of the engineers said, I wonder what that paint weighs. And so everybody scatters off. Pretty soon they're back. The paint weighed 800 pounds. So ever since then, the fuel tank, instead of being white, is the color of the natural orange foam insulation that gets sprayed on the aluminum. And so you may remember the first 10 tanks roughly were white, and since they were all orange. Not only we save 800 pounds, we reduce the cost, and we save a couple of weeks of cycle time during the manufacturing. And one other thing that I don't usually talk about, but that we were having trouble with putting this foam insulation on, and we would test it after we put it on, and we'd have to put patches all over it. And it was awfully nice to paint the patches white because it put that tank out on the launch pad with all these patches looked awful. And so it caused our people who were putting the foam on to develop better ways of putting the foam on. So we didn't have as many patches, and we also saved money, and it looked a lot better, particularly to the astronauts who saw that when they got on. So it had that hidden advantage that I didn't tell before. Thank you for the question.
Other questions? So I have one for you. I have a colleague who's the CEO of a company who argues in business there really are no moral dilemmas in decisions, just simply difficult decisions that leaders often don't want to have to make. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, hear the question okay? Okay, the question was a colleague in business who argues that there are no moral questions in business, that they're difficult questions, and that one simply has to face up with the difficult issues. Did I do justice by the question? I would not agree with that at all. I think there are a lot of moral issues that you run into in business and ethical issues very commonly. And the biggest danger I found, people don't recognize that they're dealing with an issue that has a moral aspect to it and ignore that. And they usually live to regret it. One of the major things that you see is that companies, and I speak to the attorneys in the room here, that it's one thing to protect the company against financial damage, it's another to protect the company's reputation. And in some cases, the attorneys focus, I notice, an awful lot on how can we prevent major financial loss, whereas what we really ought to be worried about is how do we protect the company's reputation. And my daughter's an attorney, and I love attorneys. I don't want her to sue me. So, but I think that's one of the things to watch. And I find it particularly with engineers. When I was teaching my various courses around here, there are lectures to engineers. Somebody would say, "Well, engineers don't deal with ethical issues. Engineers deal with the laws of nature. They're absolute. There's no judgment required. They're absolute." And boy, nothing could be further from the truth. It won't take them long out in the real world to face ethical questions, and some of them are really tough. Ethical questions I find are tough for a number of reasons. One is the big danger that you don't recognize you're dealing with an ethical question, which I would say was the case with your colleague. The second, it's not always easy to determine what is the right thing to do, even when you recognize you're dealing with an ethical question. Thirdly, it's even harder to do it very often, to do the right thing. And fourthly, unfortunately, doing the right thing very often doesn't produce the outcome you'd like to have, particularly in the short term. And so all those factors get wrapped up into the idea of ethical leadership. And I would submit that one runs into many cases, I could cite many I've run into, that where you really have to sit back. And in that case, it's a good idea to get advice from other people, particularly people who aren't involved in the issue at hand and can kind of stand back and say, what is the right thing to do? Good question.
Dr. Reese.
Thank you very much. Very, very stimulating lecture. What would you say is the relative contribution of strategic efforts versus opportunism? You look at the great success of Lockheed. That came out of opportunism. And at least from an external perspective. And you see Steve Jobs, there's a lot of opportunism there. Do you see there, for great success, that leaders can actually craft the strategic opportunities, or actually is waiting for opportunism or crises from which they can have great success?
It's a great question. I assume you all heard that. Yes? So. Okay, I got it. The question was, in leadership, how much of successes could be attributed, how many successes or much of success could be attributed to a leader thinking strategically and putting in place the things that will lead to success, and how much is opportunism, taking advantage of opportunities that happen to arise that you perhaps didn't cause yourself? Fair statement. I guess some sadness, have to say that I think it's probably 70% opportunism and 30% careful thinking ahead. And as you said, our case, it was a case of opportunism, but I also would be very fast to say that one has to be in a position to be prepared to take advantage of opportunity. And one has to have the courage to follow up when opportunities appear. It's not always easy. And to that end, before the Berlin Wall collapsed, there was reason to believe that the aerospace industry in this country was in trouble. Not because of the Berlin Wall collapsing, and not to that extent. But our management team recognized that we were looking at a tough period. Nobody else believed it. It was at the end of the Reagan era, the budget kept going up, and we began every Friday afternoon going off for 3 hours out of the headquarters, because you can't do any work in the headquarters. We'd go out, about 5 of us, and say, what are we going to do if the bottom falls out? And as I said, it fell out a lot further than we expected, but one of the things we said we've got to do is start saving money. Raise all the money we can, so that if what we think is going to happen happens, that one, we can survive it, number two, we might be able to take advantage of it. So I give us a little credit. There was a little bit of both in this case. And Dan Tellep, who ran the Lockheed Company, a wonderful man, Dan always said, when opportunity knocks, try to answer the door. Pretty good advice. In your personal life, which was not your question, but there you really see it. My whole life was one big accident. But I did take advantage of opportunities when they appeared. And, I mean, I'd start out in this direction and something would happen that would careen me over here. And I won't drag you through the whole story, but I started out to be a forest ranger, and it was just a series of examples that somehow, as my engineering friends said, caused me to descend into management. Sorry, Jay. Plead guilty.
We have one more question. Susan, please.
Would you apply your criteria for leadership to the evaluation of presidential candidates as leader of the free world?
I think I hope I didn't hear the question. Would I apply?
Would you stand here and do it, but would you use those criteria to do that?
Well, first of all, I would comment. You recall that one of my criteria for leadership is judgment, and I have the good judgment not to answer that question. But thank you for asking.
That's a great final question.
That really is. Thank you all.
If I may, we have a